It is July 18th, 2026, and there is a specific kind of silence that follows the destruction of a command center. Not the silence of an empty building, not the silence of a power outage. The silence of a place that was, until the moment before the strike, the nerve center of an entire military machine, the room where the phone rang when American aircraft entered Iranian airspace, where generals coordinated missile launches against neighboring countries, where the orders went out to fire cruise missiles and drones at civilian shipping in the world's most critical energy corridor. That room does not exist anymore. The generals who sat in it are gone. The phones that rang in it are rubble. Central Command has released new footage, and what it shows is qualitatively different from every previous wave of strikes in this conflict. Not coastal radars, not fast attack boats burning at their moorings. What the latest footage documents, including one of the largest single explosions of the entire conflict captured over Tehran, is the deliberate elimination of the IRGC's command and control brain. But let's back all the way up, because to understand why striking command centers changes this conflict's trajectory more fundamentally than any of the preceding days of strikes against military hardware, you need to understand what those centers actually did. The Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps is not a conventional military organized the way a conventional state's armed forces are. It is simultaneously a military institution, an intelligence apparatus, a political enforcement body, and a regional power projection network whose reach extends through proxy organizations in Lebanon, Syria, Iraq, Yemen, and beyond. Coordinating the flow of money, weapons, personnel, and operational direction between Tehran and every node in that network requires a communications and command infrastructure of considerable sophistication, not because the technology is advanced, but because the geographic breadth of what it manages demands an architecture that can simultaneously run a maritime harassment campaign in the Strait of Hormuz, direct proxy operations in Yemen and Lebanon, and oversee the domestic apparatus, keeping the Iranian population from turning documented discontent into organized action. That coordination ran through the IRGC headquarters and Aerospace Force headquarters that the strike footage now shows as burning ruins in Tehran. Here is the detail that changes the strategic picture beyond the immediate destruction of physical infrastructure. When you eliminate a command center, you do not merely destroy a building. You destroy the institutional memory embedded there, the contact lists, the coordination routines built over years of practice, the specific individuals who knew which proxy commander to call for which kind of operation. That kind of institutional knowledge cannot be reconstituted from backup hardware or moved to a new location and immediately restored. Not by a force operating under continuous strikes, with its leadership dispersed and underground, and its communications degraded in every strike cycle. For the first time in over a week of American operations against Iran, the people inside those centers are not reorganizing at a backup facility, because the backup facilities are next on the list, and the platform architecture now reaching Tehran tells you that no location in Iran remains outside the strike envelope. The combination of systems operating against Iranian command infrastructure represents a targeting capability that Iran's own centers were built at significant expense to survive. That they did not survive, it says something about both the sophistication of the American strike package and how badly Iran's hardened infrastructure was optimized for a threat environment a decade old rather than the one that actually arrived. The B-1B Lancer is widely believed to be participating in the deep strike component, though no official confirmation of specific airframes has been released. The operational logic points directly at it. The B-1B carries up to 24 joint air-to-surface standoff missiles, the extended range variant reaching beyond 500 nautical miles, meaning it never has to enter Iranian airspace to strike a command center deep inside the country. It launches from outside the threat ring, the missile navigates autonomously with a low radar signature, and the target goes dark before Iranian air defense can confirm anything was inbound. By the time the explosion is visible, the bomber is already outside Iranian radar coverage and turning for home. The F-35 in this architecture is not the strike platform. It is the sensor and coordination platform that makes the standoff strikes precise against targets in contested airspace. Its AN/APG-81 radar and distributed aperture system give it a battle space picture nothing else in the theater can match. Passing targeting data, identifying emerging threats, and suppressing remaining air defense nodes, while the bomber releases its cruise missiles from range. The bomber brings the payload. The fighter brings the eyes. Together, they reach any fixed facility in Iran at any depth with a level of precision the target hardening was never engineered to survive. Meanwhile, the F-15E Strike Eagles and F-16 Wild Weasels that have run every night for over a week continue their mission unchanged, suppressing whatever radar remains operational and forcing Iranian operators into the same impossible choice each night. Transmit and reveal your coordinates to an anti-radiation missile or go dark and blind yourself to the incoming strike. Neither choice saves the facility behind the radar. The IRGC Aerospace Force headquarters deserves specific attention because of what that institution actually controls. It is the institutional home of Iran's ballistic missile program, the Shahab variants, and the newer solid fuel and extended range systems Iran has publicly cited as reserve capability for future escalation. All of those systems, the missiles Iranian officials reference when they warn that significant capability has not yet been deployed, are coordinated through this command structure: targeting intelligence, launch authorization protocols, the connection between mobile launcher elements dispersed across the landscape, and the nodes that direct their fire. Those nodes in Tehran are now rubble. And here's the part of the story that Iran's own statements inadvertently confirmed before the strikes even landed. Iran's army spokesman went on record stating that a significant part of the country's military capability had not yet been used, and that Tehran's response could go beyond the enemy's expectations. Read that carefully, because the timing matters. Iranian commanders promised escalation while Central Command's aircraft were already airborne, executing the strikes that would eliminate the very infrastructure through which that escalation would have been coordinated. Claims of destroyed American aircraft that never happened. Claims of decisive strikes contradicted by an operational tempo that has not paused. The gap between the IRGC's press release reality and the observable picture is not a small discrepancy. It is the functional performance of an institution that has lost the ability to calibrate its public communications against operational reality, because the infrastructure that would produce that calibration has been systematically removed. Reports that President Trump has compared the IRGC to ISIS carry consequences beyond rhetoric. Characterizing the IRGC as a terrorist organization in that category expands the legal and operational framework for what can be targeted. Command centers become legitimate targets under counterterrorism frameworks in ways they might not be under a narrower conventional conflict framing. The proxy organizations, the IRGC funds, and directs become extensions of the same target set, rather than separate actors requiring separate justification. That shift is visible directly in the footage. Headquarters, not just hardware. 3 thresholds were crossed in a single operational period, easy to miss individually, but decisive together. First, a Hellfire strike hit the smokestack of the Belma, a tanker that had carried an estimated 38 million barrels of Iranian crude as it attempted to reach Karg Island in defiance of the naval blockade, disabling propulsion without destroying the vessel, a precise message that the blockade is real and enforcement is immediate. Second, the evening strike wave hitting command centers, air defense sites, and missile infrastructure, with an F-35 photographed refueling from a tanker while carrying external missiles that marginally reduce its stealth profile. A deliberate signal that the aircraft did not need to fully optimize for stealth against what remains of Iran's threat picture. Third, for the first time in this phase, Tehran's own air defenses activated in both eastern and western districts of the capital, confirmed by Iranian state-aligned media, residents reporting they were woken by explosions. Tehran is no longer a sanctuary, and that statement is precisely what the IRGC's own command infrastructure, now destroyed, was supposed to make impossible. Now consider what Iran's dual-track behavior reveals about the regime's internal condition. The release of an American citizen wrongfully detained since late 2024, framed by Tehran as a gesture of goodwill, arrived at the same moment Iran's foreign ministry said there were no plans for negotiation, and doubled down on keeping the Strait of Hormuz closed. Simultaneously, proxy elements continued launching attacks across the region, and a drone strike on Iraq's Basra export complex, unclaimed by any party, forced Iraq to shut down every crude loading terminal in the country, a facility handling roughly 3 million barrels per day, the third largest export capacity in OPEC. These are not the actions of a regime executing one coherent strategy. They are the actions of multiple competing power centers, each pursuing their own track without central coordination, because the coordination mechanism connecting those tracks to a unified authority has been the primary target of over a week of strikes. The civilian government wants the diplomatic track. The IRGC's hardline commanders want the military track. The proxy network is running its own operational logic. And the supreme leader, whose authority would theoretically resolve the contradiction, remains at an undisclosed location with a public silence stretching for months. When you eliminate command centers, you do not just destroy the hardware connecting factions to each other. You eliminate the institutional space where adjudication between competing impulses can happen. What survives on the other side is not a weakened version of the old command architecture. It is something qualitatively different. Dispersed operational elements with existing launch authority, disconnected from each other and from whatever political leadership they nominally answer to, each making autonomous decisions without a coordination layer to calibrate those decisions against a broader picture. That condition makes the next phase of this conflict more dangerous in the narrow tactical sense, because uncoordinated actors with launch authority are unpredictable in ways coordinated actors are not, and more decisive in the strategic sense, because a military machine whose brain has been removed cannot sustain organized operations for as long as its public posture pretends it can. The compounding economic picture running in parallel deserves its own attention. Basra's full shutdown Layered onto the Karg Island blockade enforcement and the dramatically reduced transit volume through Hormuz means a significant share of the Gulf region's oil export capacity has been removed from the market inside a single operational window through a combination of military action, blockade enforcement, and precautionary shutdown. Oil markets moving up and down, as officials have publicly acknowledged will happen throughout the operation, is not a side effect. It is a variable planners have built into their assessment of when Iran's leadership concludes that continued confrontation costs more than negotiating. That economic clock runs on its own pace, separate from the strike cycle, but both are moving in the same direction. Sitting above the entire announced target sequence is the site officials have referred to publicly as Pickaxe Mountain, an underground facility suspected of supporting Iran's nuclear program, confirmed as monitored and warned as targetable if necessary. That is where the B-2 Spirit comes in, not the standoff cruise missiles of the B-1B. Flying from Whiteman Air Force Base in Missouri on a mission that can reach Iran and return without a stopover, the B-2 can carry the GBU-57 massive ordnance penetrator, a 30,000-pound weapon designed to punch through more than 200 feet of reinforced concrete before detonating, built for exactly one purpose, reaching what sits inside a mountain when nothing short of a penetrator of that scale can get through. That capability is in reserve. The target has been named publicly. The conditional is Iran's failure to reach the negotiating table before the preceding phases run their course, and the credibility of that final item on the sequence is now established by the fact that every item preceding it has been executed exactly as announced. The honest strategic assessment, after the command center strikes, is sharper than at any previous point in this conflict. Iran's maritime harassment capability has been substantially reduced, its fast attack fleet limited to whatever survives in shallow water hiding places, its coastal defenses struck across the Gulf perimeter, its radar and communications degraded to the point that operating them coherently is now the exception. Its air defense network protecting the interior has been stripped back enough that the capital itself absorbed strikes, and aircraft are flying missions without fully optimizing for stealth. And now, for the first time in this phase, its command centers, the brain of the entire machine, have been destroyed in footage released before the fires stopped burning. What remains is real but increasingly disconnected. Mobile missile launchers dispersed across the landscape, operating without the infrastructure to coordinate their targeting and timing. Fast attack craft, hiding in shallow inlets, waiting for orders that can no longer reliably reach them. Proxy organizations with their own institutional momentum, previously calibrated by a coordination network that no longer has functioning command nodes in Tehran. A military machine without its brain is not a military. It is a collection of armed people and weapon systems making independent decisions without a common picture, common orders, or common timing, the elements that make individual parts function as something greater than themselves. Some of those independent decisions will produce dangerous outcomes: an uncoordinated launch, a proxy action nobody in Tehran authorized, an escalation the civilian government would have prevented if it could still reach the operational elements at all. That risk is real and deserves acknowledgement, but the alternative, leaving the command centers intact while continuing to strike hardware, was producing a different risk, a militarily degraded but organizationally coherent adversary that could reconstitute its capability between strike cycles faster than the strikes could permanently remove it. The command centers were the reconstitution mechanism. Remove the hardware and leave the brain, and the brain finds new hardware. Remove the brain, and whatever hardware survives cannot be effectively reconstituted by dispersed, underground, communication-degraded elements. The generals who sat in those command centers understood the sequencing before the end came. Hardware first, sensors second, air defense third, command centers after that. They had the intelligence picture that told them what came next in the announced sequence, that the B-2 sat in reserve in a specific mountain facility had already been named. What they did not have in the final moments was a way to stop it, because the radar systems that should have warned them had already been suppressed, the communications that should have let them coordinate a response had already been degraded, and the cruise missiles navigating autonomously at low altitude were already below the horizon of whatever sensors still worked when the launch order was given from well outside Iranian airspace. The Strait of Hormuz is being contested in ways it has arguably never been contested in the history of American military operations in the region. Roughly 20 ships tied to Central Command's destroyer and carrier strike group assets are maintaining a blockade that has now moved from a declared posture to a kinetically enforced one. Stealth aircraft are refueling over the Gulf before striking the most sensitive command infrastructure in the Iranian capital. Uncrewed maritime systems are quietly rewriting the cost economics of naval warfare in the shallow waters where fast attack boats used to hide with impunity. And strike packages spanning multiple locations at once are landing on the same night as one of the largest single explosions of the entire conflict, documented and released with the confidence of an organization that is not worried about how the adversary will respond, because the adversary's ability to coordinate a response has just been physically degraded. That confidence is worth sitting with for a moment, because it is not simply a communications choice. Releasing footage of a command center strike this significant, this quickly, is itself a form of pressure. It tells every remaining node in the IRGC's dispersed network that the organization meant to direct them no longer has functioning eyes or ears in the capital. It tells Iran's regional proxies that the coordination link connecting their operations to a broader strategic picture has been severed at the source. And it tells whatever remains of Iran's civilian leadership that the option of quietly absorbing this phase of the campaign and reconstituting later, the way lesser strikes on hardware alone have allowed in the past, is no longer available in the way it once was. None of this resolves the central uncertainty sitting underneath the entire campaign, which is what a fragmented IRGC actually does with the capability it has left. A dispersed, disconnected network of mobile launchers and proxy elements is not necessarily a network that stops fighting. In some ways, it is a network that becomes harder to predict, because the restraint that a centralized command structure can impose, the calculation that a coordinated actor makes about escalation risk versus benefit, requires exactly the kind of institutional continuity that has just been removed. A single field commander with surviving launch authority and no functioning chain of command above him is not constrained by the same strategic logic that would have governed a coordinated decision out of Tehran a week ago. That is the paradox sitting at the center of a decapitation strategy. It degrades the adversary's capacity for sustained, coherent action, while simultaneously removing the very mechanism that might have kept isolated actors from making unilateral decisions with disproportionate consequences. Whichever direction that paradox resolves itself in the days ahead, it will do so without the option Tehran has relied on throughout this conflict, quietly absorbing the damage and rebuilding through the same institutional channels that used to make that recovery possible.